All right, we're going to get started. This is the session on the OFCCP's latest direction regarding affirmative action for job applicants with disabilities. If that's not the flight you want to be on, you should get off before the plane takes off. I am Norris, and with me is Bindu Kolli, and we're going to be sort of splitting our time today. We have the delightful benefit of being videotaped today. I'm sure there was some fine print someplace that told us that, but so we're going to try to keep this appropriate for the videotape throughout the day. I'm going to provide the sort of legal framework, the legal background for affirmative action issues regarding people with disabilities, and some information about what the OFCCP has proposed in their regulations. And then Bindu's going to talk more about how those really will affect folks in higher ed and why we might be hearing some challenges from the higher ed community to some of the proposals by the OFCCP. The regulations were proposed in December of 2011. We'll be talking a little bit more about what the status is, but suffice it to say that we do not have final regs at this point, so this is still a bit of an open issue. As I'm sure you know, we have been living under Executive Order 11246 since Lyndon Johnson was president, 1965. That's a long time ago. And what you probably know is this was an executive order to basically enforce the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in certain ways. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 originally was only going to apply on the basis of race. This was a race discrimination statute. Gender was thrown in at the last minute, ironically as a way to kill the bill. The folks who threw gender in thought that that meant that it wouldn't pass. Surprise, surprise, and it passed. So when the executive order came out, it applied to federal contractors and subcontractors, and it had to do with affirmative action towards women and minorities, and at that point the minority group we were talking about was African Americans. Under the executive order, oops, I'm sorry, I got too fast. Under the executive order, if you're a federal contractor or subcontractor with contracts exceeding $10,000, you were covered by the order, and if you had 50 or more employees and contracts worth at least $50,000, you had to have an affirmative action plan. And there are lots of little nits and tuts about that we're not going to waste a lot of time on now in terms of exactly what has to be done. But the idea of the affirmative action plan under the executive order was to see if the workforce was reflective of the community of available workers for that particular kind of job. It was very clearly not a quota statute. It had no quotas, and it said that it was not a quota order, and it also clearly did not allow preferential hiring or promotions. So this was not an affirmative action in terms of making discriminatory decisions between folks for hiring or promotions, but rather really a recruiting order that, you know, now that we have this new group of protected folks in the workplace, you employers, if you're going to get our federal money, have to go out there and find qualified folks in your workforce area to bring into your workplace that have previously been effectively disenfranchised. And we lived with that for quite a while, and then we got Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act, which was passed in 1974, which added disabilities to the mix. It included women and minorities. And whether or not you were a federal contractor, if you were a public institution, you were covered under Section 503. So for higher ed, one way or another, every higher ed institution has been covered by one or the other of these provisions, unless it is a private institution that has specifically opted out of all forms of federal funding. And there are a handful out there that do not get any scholarship aid through the federal government, do not get any grant aid through the federal government. They've done that so that they do not fall under these laws, but that's a very limited group. So for the most part, folks in higher ed have been living with this for a long time. So the Department of Labor looked at 2010 statistics, and these statistics are pretty glaring. And what they looked at were unemployment rates, presence in the workforce, and poverty. And they compared individuals with disabilities to the general population. And as you can see, what they found is that the difference in the unemployment rate in 2010, the national rate was 9.4%. Well, the rate for individuals with disabilities was 14.8%, using the same labor pool that the unemployment statistics would come from, they looked at the disability rate, and it was 14.8%. The difference in presence in the labor force, which of course doesn't just look at the individuals available to work to be considered for the unemployment pool, but just looks at who's actually working, the difference in presence in the labor force was much, much starker. 70.1% of the workers, I know it doesn't come quite out to 100, I don't know where the rounding was, but 70.1% had no disability, 21.8% had disability. And individuals with disabilities were 3 times more likely to live in poverty. And so this is what the Department of Labor said, we need to do something about this. And I want to pause for a moment because you will hear, at least from me, and I'm thinking maybe from Bindu, some criticisms of these proposed regulations. There are some real challenges and some problems with these proposed regulations. But the problem that they were trying to attack is out there. I mean, in other words, what the Department of Labor ultimately was saying is, there are a large pool of capable, competent, qualified people out there that for one reason or another are not finding their way into the workforce. And so we're going to say, again, if you're getting our federal money or if you're covered by our federal statutes, we're going to say you need to do more to go out and get those folks. And so that's what motivated these proposed regulations. The proposals came out in July of 2010. There was a public comment period. They waited almost 18 months for that. The public comment period expired February 12th, 2012. And things have been pretty quiet from the OFCCP since that time. I was mentioning to Bindu just before we started that some human resources associations are starting to get a little bit more active and sending out kind of public letters. The Human Resources Association, HRA, just issued one in the last couple of weeks regarding problems that they see with these regulations. But we don't have any action on the regulations yet. We're not sure if and when they will come into play, whether modifications will be made because of the public comments. But we want to go over what the proposed changes are and then what effects they may have. So the first proposed change, which is really, I think, the one that's getting the most attention and is the biggest change, is what's called a 7% national utilization goal. The idea is that 7% of the workforce will be comprised of individuals with disabilities. And so it's a quota. Now they say it's not, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's a hardline number of what each job group, every place in the country, for every employer covered by either the executive order or the Rehab Act is supposed to look like. And it doesn't vary, between a professor and a janitor. It doesn't vary between Topeka and New York City. It's the same 7% across the board. This is an aspiration. That's the word that's used in the proposed regs. They make it very clear that it's not a quota or a ceiling, but it is a hard number goal, and it is a hard number goal of actual individual disabilities in the workplace. In addition, the OFCCP is considering, and their proposed reg is not specific on this except to say they're considering, a 2% sub-goal for individuals with severe disabilities, including total blindness, deafness, complete paralysis, epilepsy, dwarfism. Those are the ones that the OFCCP has mentioned. And so for that group, they're looking to see 2% in the workplace. Based on how the comments are coming through with the 7%, if I were a betting person, I would not bet that the 2% is going to ultimately carry through, especially, again, because it's not differentiated by type of job or anything else. But that's something that they're considering. So that's one big piece of these new proposed regulations. The next big piece is self-identification, much more than what we currently have. And as you know, what you currently have if you hire in the workplace is folks are given the option of filling out the self-identification form regarding various categories. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. There's very little statistical information about all of that. It's something that if you're audited, you may be asked to provide information on, but the federal government does not have a lot of national data on this, and they want a lot more information about who with disabilities is actually in the workplace so that they can start to see really what kind of involvement do we have. And as you know, there are other laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act which specifically say you can't require self-disclosure. People are allowed to keep their disabilities hidden unless it becomes an issue in the workplace. And there are lots of reasons why employers don't want to ask and don't want to know, because that can create other problems for them. So what the OFCCP is now suggesting is anonymous. Again, it's not individual person-by-person identification, but that the offer for self-disclosure be made at several stages. One is at the pre-offer stage, which many employers already do. One is at the post-offer stage, but then they also want it done annually, and their theory is that maybe when you're trying to get the job, you're a little nervous and you don't want to self-disclose because you're not sure how that will be used, but that once you have the job and you're working well in the job and everything seems to be okay, maybe you'd be more willing to do it. So there's a significant record-keeping requirement regarding getting these anonymous self-disclosures. Then there is a significant requirement regarding enhanced recruitment efforts, and there are a number of things that the OFCCP is looking for. One is using their Employment One-Stop Career Center, and all of these are things that they're saying, look, we know all those folks with disabilities are out there. We know they're not working. We're trying to get them in. Well, where are you looking? And if you remember, under what I'll call the old model, if all you did is word of mouth, that probably could get you into some trouble with the OFCCP if you didn't look like you were meeting any of your affirmative action obligations. So they're doing the same thing with disabilities. They're saying we've got to be looking farther, we've got to be doing more to recruit. So the One-Stop Career Center is one of them. And then they want to see 3 other outreach and recruitment efforts, which the employer can define, but examples they give are linkage agreements with voc rehab agencies, linkage agreements with agencies that are addressing specific disabilities, like a Veterans Affairs agency or a local organization for the blind or something like that. And then the third example that they give are linkage agreements with college recruitment and placement offices, which I think is fascinating that they look at higher ed as a place to help them fulfill these obligations, but don't understand that maybe higher ed is having some of its own challenges under some of these. Then they're asking for annual self-reviews, and these are formal written self-reviews of how are we doing against our affirmative action plan. And then voluntary programs to provide priority consideration in recruitment and hiring. And as you can imagine, a voluntary program to provide priority consideration in hiring really upends what we've been living with historically in affirmative action, because the idea is recruit the best pool possible, hire the best pool possible, but if you do a good job recruiting, your pool will look like the available workforce, and presumably your hiring will then also do that. Now they're talking about voluntary, really affirmative preference in hiring programs. So those are some of the big parts of the proposed regs, but we have more. So next is data collection and retention, and this is one that I'm sure Bindu will talk more about. This is one that's getting a lot of chatter. They want every employer to track the number of applicants and the number hired, again, comparing individuals with disabilities and individuals without. Well, what's the problem with this? I mean, the obvious one is, what did we just say about the disclosure requirements? They're voluntary and they're anonymous. So not exactly clear how we're going to get those numbers, but this is a core part of what the OFCCP wants. The OFCCP believes that it has identified, and maybe properly has identified, a problem out there, but it doesn't have the statistical information to really help it tackle the problem. So it thinks we need more information. We need to know really how many individuals with disabilities are applying. So is the problem that we're not getting them to apply, or really how many individuals with disabilities are getting hired? So is the problem at the hiring place? But if what you're dealing with are anonymous voluntary self-disclosures, this may not get you there. And as I mentioned, we have some of these other statutes that employers are going to bump up against. Then they want an annual calculation of applicant, hire, and job fill ratios. So in other words, take that statistical information that we just got and compare disabled applicants to non-disabled applicants. There's your first ratio, disabled hires versus non-disabled hires. And then they also want to know how many job openings weren't filled. And I take it that the presumption is if it wasn't filled, it's because the employer didn't think they could find the qualified person to fill it. That's, as we know, not the only reason that jobs aren't filled, but that's the one I think that they're trying to zero in on. So employers would have an obligation to calculate these, and then they would extend the current amount of time for maintaining all of this data to 5 years. Another big area of change is the reasonable accommodation area, and you all know what the obligations are under the Rehab Act, under the ADA, under state statutes you might have for reasonable accommodation. The OFCCP now wants to require written procedures for requests for accommodation. Now, in higher ed, many already have that, but there has not been a legal requirement to have exactly what the OFCCP is requiring here. But then, if there is a delay, not clear how long a delay is a delay, but a delay or a denial of a request for accommodation, the OFCCP wants a written explanation of that delay or denial. And if you are denied the accommodation, that written explanation, I'm a defense lawyer, so here's where I break out in hives, that written explanation goes to the person to whom you denied the request, along with information about how to contact the OFCCP to assert their rights if they don't like the denial. Right, so as I said, this one causes me to break out in hives, but that's what they're looking for in reasonable accommodation. And then they incorporate simply the standards of the ADA Amendments Act into some of their definitions of disabilities and that sort of thing, which I think whether they did it or not, we would be living with that. I'm going to go over some of the OFCCP's forecasted effects of these changes. Bindu's going to chime in on this as well, and then she's going to talk about some of the recipient side beliefs of the effects of some of these changes, especially in higher ed. So one of the forecasted effects of the changes is that the OFCCP, frankly, just doesn't think this is going to cost that much in time or money. They believe it has de minimis financial expenses and minimal personnel time. They think that the annual self-assessment, which is required, will take 30 minutes a year. They think that the reasonable accommodation procedures, just having a written policy for reasonable accommodation procedures, will take 2 hours. And they think that the time that all of this will take will come out to $172 the first year, and then an annual recurring cost of $301, which I think we would probably all agree is de minimis if that really were the time that this was going to take. They think that it will be easier for the OFCCP to detect deficiencies during audits, and I think this is certainly one of the things they're trying to do, is that, you know, the way this has historically worked, as you know, is that there's a lot of argument about what is the available workforce, and then you look at how the current workforce looks, but in the area of disabilities, you don't know what, I mean, you just know kind of generic statistics, but not actually what the available workforce for a particular job might be and how many of those folks would have disabilities, because it's not something that, forget about the application process, people aren't required to disclose it just out in the ether, so there's no way to know whether the applicants that you have reflect that pool in such statistic certainty as the OFCCP seems to be looking for. And then, as I said at the beginning, I think they're looking for a significant increase in the hiring of qualified disabled individuals. And I want to say just a few more words about this before we turn it over to Bindu, and then we've planned to leave quite a bit of time at the end for your questions and for some discussion on this. I declared my stripes right up front. I am a defense lawyer. I defend institutions of higher education and disabilities cases and these kinds of things. I do think that it is undoubtedly true that there is a vast untapped pool of resources out there in terms of human capital. And we know that whenever a new group, whether it is based on race or gender or, you know, national origin or anything, whenever a new group sort of starts to become integrated into the workforce, we know how much more is out there that we're not getting, and it takes lots and lots of time to do that. So I think that they may have identified the existence of a problem, but I think what we'll have to talk about more as we go on throughout our session here is whether the solutions they've proposed are really going to get to the heart of that problem, or whether they're just going to require a lot of work on a part of a lot of employers, but not really advance the ball down the field too much. The OFCCP thinks that I'm certain because of what they've written, that they thought that these proposed regulations were minor, didn't think they'd get much reaction, didn't think that they would be too problematic, and that is not the information that we're getting. Interestingly, though, I did take a look at some of the comments that were filed during the initial process, and I would say it took a while for folks to wake up to this. I would say that there weren't as many comments as you might have thought in such an organized way as you might have thought until we got to the February timeframe and people started to realize, oh my goodness, these might really happen. And I think that the OFCCP is now clearly aware of what's becoming a bit of a drumbeat from many areas, certainly not just from institutions of higher education. But as Bindu will talk about, there are some ramifications specifically in this area of employment, specifically in what I call the core higher ed issues, hiring of professors and those kinds of things, that really make institutions of higher education a much more challenging issue than it is for just a generic workforce. And with that, I will turn it over to Bindu with the magic clicker. And they asked if you wanted to have cards for questions. You don't need to have cards for questions, but you do need to have questions. So start thinking about them, and then we'll be ready to answer them.
Am I just pressing the screen button?
You just press there, and it goes forward.
Got it. So before I get started on the effects that the higher ed community is concerned about, I just want to sort of touch on a couple of the things on this slide that Megan teed up for me. So I'm at the University of Delaware, and we just survived an OFCCP audit of our affirmative action plan. So in the question and answer section, if you have any questions about that process, feel free to ask. With no findings, I might also mention. So I am a wee bit critical of their estimation that it will only take 30 minutes to do a self-assessment. Doing our self-assessment of just our affirmative action plan for gender and minority, countless hours. Our HR systems are much more decentralized, which I'm sure many of your institutions are as well. So, I mean, frankly, getting someone on the phone from every college takes longer than 30 minutes. And then their 2-hour estimation for not just the development of reasonable accommodation procedures, but the implementation of them, just I don't think is realistic. So I'll sort of talk about that as I get into my slides about higher ed in particular, but I just wanted to sort of lay out these time estimations. And I just lived this, and it's just, at least at our university, and we're not that huge a university, it just wasn't the case. There we go. So moving from the OFCCP's perspective, I want to discuss the concerns that the higher ed community specifically has with these changes. Before I start ticking through these concerns, I want to echo what Megan said and say that the ultimate goal of these provisions is worthwhile and laudable. I mean, Megan stated some of the demographic information that we have. Qualified disabled individuals aren't hired to the extent that they should be. And I think it's a worthy goal for us as higher ed institutions to support. That being said, I'm critical of these suggested provisions because I don't think it gets to that goal as seamlessly as it could otherwise. So the first concern that higher ed communities have are the great administrative burdens. So let's talk about it broadly. Time and money will need to be spent updating our current data collection software or applicant flow tracking software. Additional time and money will need to be spent establishing disability-focused recruitment relationships with organizations, with publications, with career fairs, all to sort of reach that lofty aspirational 7% goal. And even more time and money will need to be spent educating our HR professionals, our applicants, our employees about what it even means to be disabled, considering we're going to have to survey them annually. So more specifically, UNC, is anyone from here from UNC or the University of Nebraska? No. UNC and the University of Nebraska estimated costs for their own institutions. And so I just want to read you their estimates for what they think financially it'll cost them to implement these provisions. So UNC calculated the costs of complying with the proposed revisions, which included necessary expenses like staff time and record-keeping software, and determined that compliance would annually cost several $1,000s at smaller institutions and hundreds of thousands of dollars at larger institutions. Even more specifically, the University of Nebraska ran its own calculations. For Nebraska, reviewing the job descriptions for all 10,000 positions and assuming a conservative rate of $55 an hour would result in an annual expense of $550,000 to implement these regulations. I mean, I have no basis to determine if that's accurate versus the OFCCP's estimation. I mean, I guess it would be somewhere in the middle. I want to say closer to what the higher ed community is estimating, but that sort of gives you a flavor for the disconnect that OFCCP and higher ed institutions have with regard to estimating the administrative burdens that these provisions will have. So the next challenge is the difficulty in meeting the 7% goal due to the lack of or anonymous self-identification. The ability to meet the 7% utilization rate is ultimately in the hands of the job applicants and employees and whether or not they determine that they want to self-identify as disabled. So 2 points to that. One, some individuals don't know that they're disabled by, as they would be defined under the regulations. So it's an education piece. A lot of the applicants don't know that they're disabled. And two, many individuals with disabilities may choose to maintain their privacy and not share with their employer, or even more probably the case, their potential employer, that they have a disability. So therefore, there might be colleges and universities that are actually meeting the 7% goal, but are reporting significantly fewer numbers because they're just not, their applicants and their employees are just not self-identifying. The last bullet on this is the difficulty in assessing outreach of recruitment efforts if applicants remain anonymous. So this is really a double-edged sword. The fact that disability status is analyzed by job group seriously diminishes the anonymous character of the survey. Anecdotally, we at the University of Delaware have a number of job groups that have 1 to maybe 10 employees within that job group. So if there are employees that are anonymously identifying as disabled, there's a high probability that an employer will be able to deduce the identity of that individual, even though we are telling the employee or the applicant that they are responding anonymously. That being said, employers can't really avoid that problem because the 7% aspirational goal is by job group. So we can't extrapolate any further than job group because we need to know if our recruitment efforts are working job group by job group. So that just sort of brings up an issue about the fact that we're telling our applicants and our employees that their identification is anonymous, but it might not always be the case. So Megan went over where the 7% aspirational goal came from. And much of the chatter in the higher ed community is that goal just doesn't make sense for higher education teaching and academic job positions specifically. According to the University of California, almost all faculty positions require a master's, professional degree, or doctorate degree, but only 10.3% of the workforce obtained a post-bachelor's degree, according to the 2009 data set, which is the same data set the OFCCP used to establish that 7% aspirational goal. So this begs the question of whether the OFCCP should use a separate goal for the academic workforce, one that more realistically reflects the number of disabled individuals in the workforce that have obtained a post-bachelor's degree. The next concern for the higher ed community is the annual training requirement. I know at our university, especially after Title IX and the Dear Colleague letter last year, Annual training is a bad word in our, in our college, particularly when it comes to training of faculty. So, if we want to educate all the individuals in the recruitment process, that means more than just training the HR professionals. That means training the faculty and staff that are sitting on these search committees. According to the OFCCP's proposed regulations, we should be providing annual training to all personnel involved in the recruitment, screening, selection, promotion, and disciplinary processes. That's hundreds, thousands of people. The time, effort, cost, and overall feasibility of this requirement is a concern really for any institution, but for higher ed community, for higher ed institutions in particular. And I also want to sort of flag again, we're supposed to do this for $172 a year. I'm sorry, $301 a year. I respectfully question that. And the next concern is the significant increase in data collection requirements. The additional data collection will just simply need new software, additional manpower, the creation of relationships that don't necessarily already exist with our state employment agencies. And to add even another wrinkle to that, information from state employment agencies is not, one, it's not always electronic, and two, it very rarely syncs seamlessly with our human resource software. So the tracking alone would require a significant expenditure of time and money and manpower within organizations. So the next concern, the use of comparative population data may not be an accurate measure of actual possible applicant pool. Megan mentioned that this 7% aspirational goal is national. So like she said, it's the same for Topeka and New York. I mean, our university is in Newark, Delaware. It's a pretty small community. So it might not be a completely accurate and representative goal for us to say that 7% of our applicant pool meets the disabled qualifications. And going one step further, sort of dovetailing with what I talked about before, there's also really no data to say that for every job position, 7% of that pool it will be disabled individuals. I know whenever I sort of do this, provide this sort of information to our executive committee, our provost or one of the deans will invariably ask me, but Bindu, I'm hiring a nuclear physicist that has this one subspecialty. There's 2 people in the world that do it. It's not my fault that those 2 people are white males. What am I supposed to do? And I roll my eyes, but it's a valid concern that he has. He has his job, which is to hire in that niche. So putting that 7% goal across the board for every job group, including nuclear physicists that head our, biomedical center, is not a realistic expectation for higher ed institutions. And these last 2 points that I make, I want to sort of put a star towards. The first is the chilling effect of pre-offer inquiry. Because this rule will take some time to get used to, particularly for applicants may be reluctant to disclose accurate disability information pre-offer, which is required, the pre-offer, thereby chilling the effect of accurate reporting. Right or wrong, applicants might be turned off and hence turned away once they get asked this question before they even get interviewed, before they even are adjudged to have met the minimum qualifications. Relatedly, the solicitation of pre-offer information of disability that is unrelated to job functions brings up a privacy concern. So if an applicant does not need, and so this basically boils down to, if an applicant does not need an accommodation to complete the job functions for the position they're applying for, why do we need to know if they're disabled? It won't affect their job function. It won't affect their position. They're not asking for and we're not required to provide any accommodation. So is it a privacy issue that we're soliciting information that really isn't related to the ability for them to perform their job functions? So I want to close with this question that I continue to struggle with as I reviewed and analyzed these regulations and read many institutions' commentary on these regulations. Are these changes the best way to achieve the intended effect? I also want to sort of open this up to discussion with all of you. Race and gender discrimination strike me as a different animal than discrimination against disabled individuals. I think the focus should probably be paid on education of hiring officials about accommodations and education of hiring officials and search committees about the fact that qualified disabled individuals are out there and able to perform the job functions with either no or with very minor accommodations, rather than focus, which I think that a lot of these provisions do, than focus on burdensome data collection, which is expensive, costs a lot in time, and as Megan also said, we're not sure where the OFCCP will go with this, but hopefully they'll read some of these comments that my higher ed colleagues have been providing them and hopefully sort of side with us. That's it.
I just want to chime in on a few things that Bindu said from the defense lawyer's standpoint, and it's remarkable when you think about it in the practical terms that she thinks about it, how obvious it is that some of these regulations are going to be a challenge. I've spent a fair amount of time training faculty. I don't cost $301 to do it, so we'll start there. Faculty, I often say, are the only employees in the United States who do not understand that their employer is the institution that's issuing their check. They're all independent contractors. Every one of them is a sort of fiefdom unto their own. Even faculty that are in what we would think of as managerial positions like department chairs, it usually takes till you're about a dean until you understand that you actually work for the institution and that you're being trained to act on behalf of the institution, not to just sort of, use your own best judgment about what you want to do. So I find the idea of training everybody who could be involved in any way, shape, or form in a search, et cetera, that's really going to be at least every tenured faculty member, and in many cases, some non-tenured faculty members. One of the things that I think is, Bindu mentioned just at the end, that disabilities are different from race and gender, and they are, partly because of the disclosure issues. I happen to be married to a black PhD chemical engineer faculty member. And I can tell you that if there is a search for a PhD chemical engineer, he gets searched every time, every institution in the country. Because you know who you've got your two neurophysicists, whatever is with you. You know who has those PhDs out there. That's easily achievable information to know who are the folks that have those specialties. And so if you're, exercising your normal affirmative action obligations, you know exactly who to go after. And then if the person says they don't want to be considered, well, there's not much that you can do about that. Or if the person is considered, but the person who's the best in the world is also in the pool, there's not much that you can do about that either. Here, we don't know for whom we are looking. We don't know. I mean, you may have read the papers of somebody and read everything they've ever written and everything about every experiment they've ever done and not know they're in a wheelchair. It's entirely possible that you don't know that until the person would show up at your door. But in your recruiting, how do you know where to go to identify those people? And this is my real concern, and Bindu and I are speaking again tomorrow on another issue, and you're welcome to come back. Tomorrow we're talking about where the OFCCP and the EEOC seem to have been bumping into each other. There is a national statute out there that has been getting stronger and stronger that prohibits you from knowing anything unless the person wants you to know it. And you're not allowed to make pre-offer inquiries, You're only allowed to make post-offer inquiries in terms of job relatedness. You're not allowed to use the information. You're not allowed to be paternalistic and force accommodations that the person does not need or want. I mean, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of cases and pages and pages and pages of regulations on how to incorporate individuals' disabilities into the workforce. The affirmative action obligations have always been a recruitment tool. That's how they've always been defined, as how do we get more people to apply so that we can have applicant pools that better reflect the available working community. And that's what the focus has always been. Now, we're going to talk about how to advise somebody they're not getting an accommodation once they're employed. There's a whole statute on that. This just seems like you just want to put the EEOC and the OFCCP in a room and say, look, you all hash it out, and then you all tell us what to do. But it's not just the unwieldiness and the cost and expense of some of these things. It's that some of this is directly contrary to what you've been training your people to do. You've been training your people, don't ask about disabilities. You've been training your people, deal with the problem, deal with the behavior, don't impugn, insert a disability into the situation where it isn't obviously there because you're going to get regarded as cases and those sorts of things. And so I'm not even sure what training you would do, because it's going to seem to me to be contrary to some of the training you've been trying to do already. So, as you can see, there are some concerns. We would